You ready for today's workout?
Yeah. What are we doing?
Training our core.
So like a bunch of sit-ups and stuff like that?
Not necessarily. Everyone talks about the core, and I think we all know the importance of training the core, but I'm not convinced that most people have thought deeply into what the core even is. What are you referring to? Is it the abs? Is it the lower back? Like, what exactly is the core?
Like the core of an apple, the core of the earth. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, there's some crazy things in the core of the earth, so I hear.
So today we're going to be discussing the importance of the core, apart from obviously looking shredded at the beach.
And having abs.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that once you guys understand the function of the core, it'll help you conceptualize how to train it properly. And I'll give you a hint, it's not about crunches and sit-ups and all that quote-unquote ab stuff.
Thank God.
So today we'll discuss the function of the core, some common misconceptions about how to train it, and why it's important to train it in the first place. And we'll give you the best training methods for training the core properly.
You looked like you wanted to say something more.
I did. We're going to discuss the function of the core, go over some common misconceptions about core training, and then give you the absolute best bang for your buck core exercises. So stick around.
As always, I'm Victor, Julian, and we're here in Miami Lakes, Be Fit Miami Lakes specifically, in front of La Vaquita, not by any sort of garbage disposal areas, nothing like that at all.
La Vaquita.
La Vaquita, we're right there. Tony's Pizza, you know it. Come work out.
Might get...
The what?
Huh?
Come have a cafecito with us, you know, come have an overall good time while we work on your core
Wow.
properly.
Hell yeah. When you say the core, what do you think most people think of?
Abs.
Just abs?
Just abs. I think that this little area right here, rectus abdominis,
I think
if you're nasty.
people will think that, okay, well, it's more than just abs, but then when you go deeper and say, well, what are you talking about? They'll probably be like, well, I don't really know, but I know that this area is important.
Well, you hear it all the time, like especially with like somebody's trying to train, especially if you don't know too much, you'll hear somebody like, oh, brace your core. And really what they're just saying is like, tighten up right here. And a lot of people don't really know
What that means.
Yeah, or that the core is this whole area, including even some of the like lower back and gluteal area.
Oh yeah, for sure. And that's the thing, that depending on who you ask, like what expert you ask, the core has different, there's no one definition from it, but we can all agree that it's basically the muscles that are in the midsection, right? But the reason I say that is because, like you said, some experts would consider hip muscles and gluteal muscles part of the core because they help with stabilizing and things that we're going to get into. So it's not necessarily... What we used to learn in school is that there's 32 muscles that make up that midsection area.
I have 33.
Whoa. Okay. But regardless of getting deep into the anatomy, which most people don't really need to, we're going to explain more importantly what the function of those muscles are and why it's important to think about them and know how to brace your core, what the core is actually doing when you're moving, when you're exercising, and in everyday life. So that's what we really want to get deep into. It's going to be practical, I promise. It won't be too
Scientific,
anatomical.
Yeah, and ironically, I think the core and its purposes are underrated as opposed to like people just thinking about abs all the time. So hopefully we put some importance, shed some light into that.
Yeah, I would say that what's overrated is training the abs. Again, like we talked about in last podcast, probably because you want to see your abs and you want to have a six-pack, but neglecting the other areas of the core that are more important than just like that spinal flexion of crunching.
Yeah, things like anti-rotation, load bearing. Like
we're gonna talk about all that. Oh yeah, baby.
We're gonna get into some
Stick
spicy
around.
stuff.
So the only anatomy thing that I'll talk about is, you know, everyone knows about the abs, right? That's the technical term is rectus abdominis, the ones in the front that you can see, the six-pack, if you will. But I think most people know about the obliques. They know about the lower back and would consider that part of their core just because it surrounds the midsection.
I think you're giving them a lot of credit. They know that these are the obliques, but then they're like, oh, I train them like this, right? Doing these exercises?
Yeah. What I wanted to mention is that there's a lot of musculature that's a lot deeper and serves a different purpose. So what they call the inner unit, which is the muscles that are responsible for more like deep bracing. What are you laughing at?
I'm not laughing at anything.
Deep. I can't say deep. I can't say a lot of shit in this podcast because of you.
It wasn't that.
Okay.
It was something a deeper unit or something like that. I was like, I got a deeper unit for you.
So this inner unit, think of it as a corset. They're holding everything together from all angles, from the front and the back, from the bottom and the top, right? So these are muscles like your diaphragm, your multifidus in the back. What else?
Una faja.
Like a faja, basically.
Okay,
yeah. Transverse abdominis. We don't have to know all this stuff, but The reason I'm bringing it up is because when we say brace your core, when we say this creates an intra-abdominal pressure, especially when you're lifting. So when you're doing that brace, those are the muscles that are mainly engaged. You're not engaging your rectus abdominis, your like six pack when you brace your core necessarily. It might be involved in that, but there are much deeper muscles that are serving as that deep stabilizing to basically protect all of this as you lift or as you move.
Yeah, the only time you're really like flexing all these muscles when you're taking a selfie for your MySpace, right?
For sure, yeah. Lifting your shirt up like this.
Like Usher. All right, so let's talk about the actual function of the core. What does it do? Why do we need to strengthen it? Why is it so important?
Yeah, it's super important. And to keep it simple, because this can get very technical, let's talk about three things that the core is responsible for. One is stabilizing. Another one is initiating actual movement. So that would be like a crunching type of mechanism where the spine is flexing. And then the third is as a force transfer. So transferring energy from the bottom, from the lower limbs to the upper, or vice versa. It's just basically what sits in the middle and it's transferring. We're gonna get into this, so if it sounds confusing, don't worry. But it's those basically three things.
Okay. All right, so let's dissect those three. You said the first one was stability, right?
Yeah.
So what exactly is it stabilizing?
I think this is the most important one because it's the most overlooked one. People think that the core, again, the abs, well, I gotta do this to train them. The main role of these muscles in your midsection is to stabilize while you move, right? So whether you're thinking about it or not, as you're moving, as you're going up a flight of stairs, you're picking your kid up from the ground, your core is stabilizing in order for you to do those movements. Additionally, it's preventing you, it's stabilizing and holding things together to prevent unwanted movements, right? There's a lot of important things in here, right? So all these muscles are engaging constantly, whether you know it or not. Like if I shove you right now and you have to like go and catch your, get your balance again, your core is bracing just to make sure that everything's in place there. You're not doing any unnecessary twisting or bending. And you don't have to think about that. A lot of it is unconscious. Now, when you do think about it is when you exercise, which we're going to get into.
Funny thing is you mentioned when if you shove me, which I don't know why you would do something like that to me, but you've seen those Boston Dynamics robots that they're always, for some reason, pushing them with a stick. If you look at the trunk, torso of them, it's solid. So you push them and they're still like this area is tight. So I guess that's a nice little way of demonstrating that that middle area can be so important.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I don't know anything about Boston Dynamics, but I would guess that that's one of their biggest challenges when trying to create like a human-like thing is, yeah, I can make something that has locomotion, that walks and stuff like that. But as soon as I get you off balance, that's when your stabilizers have to kick in more. By the way, they're working when you're walking, for sure. They're working all the time.
Yeah.
But once you're doing things that involve more complicated movements, these muscles are firing like crazy. And the one thing that I want everybody to know is that is the main idea. This is why we do some of the exercises that we're going to talk about later, which you think, how is that working my core? I'm just holding weight on one side. But you're engaging all these muscles to keep you from bending. So it's an anti-movement almost. It's keeping you from moving in an unnecessary way.
I actually just told a client yesterday, she was like, oh, but can we do more core today? Can we do more? I think she said more abs.
You did a lot of it already.
We were doing bent over rows while she said it. And I told her, well, if you weren't using your abs, your back would be round, you'd look terrible. You wouldn't be able to do this properly without the use of these muscles.
And the last thing on stability is posture, right? These muscles are responsible for, they're not the only ones, but they are responsible for keeping you upright and just having somewhat of good posture. I know everyone's gonna say, oh, I have bad posture, but your muscles are still working to kind of keep you upright.
Yeah, to keep you erect.
We're gonna talk about erectors.
Okay.
But not the type that you're thinking.
Force transfer, am I right? So when Yoda trained Luke, he had to give him like...
Who's Luke?
Skywalker.
Oh.
Wow.
I'm kidding.
Holy shit.
I'm not living in that much of a rock.
Shit. So number 2, you said it was force transfer. Besides Star Wars, what would that mean for a layman?
So this is another one that I didn't really know about until I went to grad school and started studying it, but it's very important in sports. But just to give you a quick insight on what it is, it's basically think of your core as a bridge between the lower and upper body, right? Anytime you're doing a movement, you are transferring energy from one to the other for most movements, right? So I'll give you the example of sprinting. When you sprint, you're generating a lot of force from your feet, but it goes all the way up the chain through your legs and through your midsection and even your arms, because that's why you swing the arms. If you're not swinging your arms, you don't know how to run. Yeah, I'm looking at you. But the example is there. You go from the bottom and it transfers all the way up through the body. The core is that bridge that keeps that energy transfer efficient, right? The more efficient you run, well, that's what happens when you're inefficient, right? You've seen somebody doing something athletic for the first time And the most efficient people in the world are world-class athletes, right? You watch an NFL player or an NBA player or an Olympian do something and you're like, man, that is smooth. It's so smooth. It's because that energy transfer is on point.
Yeah,
that core is doing so much, but that takes obviously like thousands of hours of rehearsal.
Think of it like a really good funnel. They have like a great funnel that no energy is wasted from the legs all the way up.
I'm glad you said energy wasted because there's something we call energy leaks, where when you see somebody doing something inefficient, you can tell that energy is quote unquote leaking. What I mean by that is if you're doing a walking lunge and you're wobbly all over the place, that's telling me that that connection, that core strength, those stabilizers are not developed yet enough to keep you stable and keep you on track to do those lunges, right? So it's really interesting when you think about it. This isn't just about athletes. This is everyday life.
Yeah. A good example is when you see somebody trying to jump, somebody that's not used to like jumping for max height, they disconnect, and that disconnect, you see it all the time, you're wasting so much power. Your legs are generating, but you don't know how to properly transfer it.
Yep,
so
exactly. And that's not, and people would think like, well, that's a leg thing.
Yeah.
No, first of all, anything that's like total body, like locomotion or sprinting or running or throwing, nothing is like upper or lower. It's everything together.
Throwing a ball is, I think, one of the best examples of that.
It's such a good example.
Rotation, you got power driven from the legs, and obviously you're not throwing with your legs, you're throwing with your arm. Sorry, I just spit on you. You're throwing with your arm, so that all is dependent on that core being efficient. If you waste anything here, you're losing gas on your throw.
Exactly. Look at a slow-mo of a high-level pitcher and just look at the way that the force transfer through the entire body. The legs are doing crazy stuff, the core is doing. So again, if that pitcher were to be like an amateur and just learning how to pitch, you're losing a lot of that through that force transfer. So again, it's just that transferring of energy. And there's kinetic chains. There's chains of muscle groups that work together, and the core is kind of like what links in between them.
And what was the third one again?
The third one is what most people think about when they think about training the core, which is moving the midsection, right? So spinal flexion, flexing like into a crunch or extension or lateral side to side. Right now I'm moving the spine, and the core is responsible for a lot of that movement, whether it's like the back of the core, the front. And again, that's important. I'm not gonna say it's not important. It definitely is, but I would say it's not the primary role of the muscle because you have so many muscles here that are just stabilizing all day long.
I have a question, but it's kind of stupid.
Just ask. I'm sure somebody else has it.
Okay, so you know when you get caught off guard, like you're reaching for a pencil or something and you have to sneeze and you like hurt yourself a little bit?
I would not.
No, but like
my herniation.
No, but like you can't control it.
No, 100%.
You're like going for something, and you're like, oh, that's weird. Is that because you weren't properly braced, like you weren't prepared for that explosive movement?
Yeah, for sure. Okay. It's like it's like somebody putting you at the bottom or like in the middle of a deadlift without you thinking about it.
Oh shit, I'm here.
I'm in the middle of a deadlift.
Okay.
The reason I say it is because there's so much intra-abdominal pressure with a sneeze. That's why sneezing it's like more. It sounds kind of ridiculous. Kind of ridiculous to say, but you can't even do cocaine in America anymore. But it is aggressive as hell.
It's aggressive.
So, you sneeze. By the way, I never do that. If I'm like in a weird position, I feel a sneeze coming, let me straighten out because my body is not prepared for this.
I mean, there's been professional athletes that hurt their back sneezing. It's crazy.
Or break a rib or something. Crazy things.
Yeah, sneezing is one of the most explosive things a lot of people will do today.
Yeah, don't sneeze if you're unprepared, okay?
Yeah.
That's really what the big takeaway from today's podcast. And then there's a bonus. I know I only mentioned 3. Arvidas a bonus.
Good to us.
But the last one I'll briefly touch on is breathing, because people don't think about the core when it comes to breathing, but like the diaphragm, for example, plays a huge role when it comes to like deep breathing. So when we talk about like diaphragm breathing or deep breathing or belly breathing, the diaphragm is doing a lot of work there with inhalation.
You hear it a lot in yoga, you hear it a lot.
Exactly.
Belly.
Yeah, which is something, just as a side note, that everyone that works out should learn how to do, because it literally relaxes your body. It sends signals of relaxation to the body. It's different than the everyday breathing, unconscious breathing that we do.
Which
but
I
anyway,
hate. Speaking of that, now that you mentioned it, I'm breathing actively and I hate it.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about blinking and I'm thinking about everything. I hate it.
Yep, posture.
Keep blinking.
About posture too. But yeah, the core, those are core muscles too. And like the pelvic floor, for example, is another important muscle. The only time I think that people think about it is
squatting.
Well, no, I'm not the average person, but like
shitting?
No, man. It's through pregnancy.
Oh, yeah.
They talk a lot about the pelvic floor strengthening during pregnancy, and then postpartum, it weakens, right? Because everything's been stretched. So then you got to do a lot of like Kegels and other pelvic floor exercises, which, by the way, there's a little hack. You don't only have to do like specific exercises. I'll tell you how to target the pelvic floor. You guys are probably doing it all the time. When we talk about the exercises. But
Holding
yeah,
farts?
breathing. Holding your farts? I heard that's not good for you.
No, me neither. I never do it. But is that like a
We
is
know.
that a form of core training?
That's a great question. Chat.
Is farting itself a core exercise? Because you kind of gotta pujear,
Yeah, into
How do you say
abdominal
pujear?
pressure.
strain.
Write in the comments. Yeah.
Point.
How do you say pujear?
How do you say pujear? Like when you force a fart? This is getting crass.
Okay, so by the way, speaking of that, the way we learned in school how to engage that inner unit that I was talking about in the
It's like
pelvic
this.
floor, that's a good way, but it was more of when you hold in a fart. Because when you hold in a fart, you have to create that intra-abdominal pressure to not release.
Why do you have to talk like this while you're doing it?
Well, that's how you know you're properly bracing.
I learned a good way. I I read it once that said, pretend that somebody's gonna throw a piano at you. Obviously, it's an exaggeration, but it's like
Who can
Like-
throw a piano?
me. But like catching something, like if I'm gonna throw that 50-pound sandbag at you, that alone, that you do it kind of subconsciously. But I think that's a good way to that. And I always tell people, oh, I'm walking by and pretend I'm gonna.
Yeah.
That automatically like you kind of tighten up a little bit.
Yeah. All right, so now let's switch gears here and go into some common misconceptions and myths about the core.
We love our myths.
We sure do.
And myth number 1 is core training is mostly like sit-ups and abs and things of that nature.
Yeah, and I think we just discussed this, that I'm sure by now you realize that that's just one function of the core, right? If you're only doing sit-ups and crunches and variations of those, you're training, which by the way, you're not only training your abs when you do sit-ups, there's a lot more internal things going on, but again, it's just one angle, that spinal flexion, flexing forward, when the core is doing so many other things.
It's like saying, oh, I'm gonna work on my arms and only like overhead press. Like you're only doing
Exactly.
one motion for such a diverse muscle group.
But it's even worse, it's your arm times 10 because your arm only does a few things, but the
Yeah.
core does a ton
Does
of
everything
things.
we've discussed, yeah.
Yep. Okay, so let's say somebody wants a more well-rounded approach that's not just crunches. What are all the other movements to train when it comes to the core? Let's go through them one by one.
Well, there's spinal extension, which we did talk about the lower back
Mhm.
being part of the muscles, so that's a good one. That's a big one.
Yeah, so that would be like a low, it's hard to...
A hyperextension?
If you're just listening, but yeah, it'll be like a hyperextension where you're targeting the lower back. And by the way, you target the lower back with a lot of exercises, so you don't have to go crazy with hyperextensions.
Yeah, be careful because we see a lot of people programming like back squats, then deadlifts, then RDLs, things that are straining your lower back.
Then lower back extensions.
And then you do
Yeah.
hyperextensions. Like, be wary, especially in this day and age, that most people have some issues with their lower back.
Okay, then we got something called ang.
Ang.
All right.
Definitely putting that.
Do not, please. So then we have something called anti-extension. These are going to be a little confusing if you've never heard of them, like anti-rotation, anti-extension. What it means is that you're resisting movement, right? So anti-extension means you're doing something like a plank where you're holding your posture and you're trying not to arch that arching of the back is extension. So it's anti-extension.
That little lower back bridge. over here.
Exactly. So we're talking planks, we're talking ab wheel rollouts, which most people do horribly wrong. Okay, those are very hard. Things like dead bugs, where I'm trying to go through the movement without extending. There's so many good exercises for those. Some of my favorites, honestly.
And that's something that we need, I think, now more than ever in this day and age of everybody trying to pop their butts out and they cause that little lower back.
That lumbar lordosis.
I think it's never been more important to combat that because a lot of people, especially women, they lay down and they already have that. And they have like a little bridge down here. Most of those people end up with lower back pain.
Yeah, that's when you have to really, as a coach, cue the movement. Yeah, it's like if you're doing like a dead bug or something, make sure your whole back is flat on the ground because sometimes you'll see that curvature and you know that the lower back is starting to take over and then you're not really using the deep core muscles that we're trying to target.
Yeah, and then you'll see it again when they're overhead pressing and things like that and they start
Yup.
leaning back.
See it all the time.
One of my favorite functions is anti-rotation. So like pail-off presses, resisting against a band that's tied up next to you. I feel like that one's highly overlooked by the regular layman.
Yeah, either ISO, like isometric
Just
holds,
hold or
or presses.
pressing,
Yeah, you're basically resisting from it taking you.
Which is something that's overlooked. And like I said, if you're not actively thinking of it, you're really not going to train that.
That's the thing, is that a lot of these exercises don't look like much. Like,
Yeah.
you know how many times I've told a newbie, okay, we're going to do this. it doesn't look like much. You're
Yeah.
just standing there holding a band, but do it.
Yeah.
And then tell me what you feel. And
Yeah.
once I'm like, oh my God.
Oh, my whole left
Everything's
side.
engaging,
Yeah.
you know, and they can't even keep their posture, which again, energy leaks in the system. So the opposite of that would be rotation, right? Rotational components, another one that I think most people, if you're not doing
it.
athletic training, well, not just butcher it, they don't do it at all. They're only doing Russian
twists.
twists. that's the
But
only thing.
poorly.
And horribly.
Yeah.
So here would a good example would be like a med ball throw. So that would be
Yeah.
more like a power rotation, but you can do a peel-off rotation as well. You can do chops, certain things like that, because the body does rotate. So why wouldn't we, like, I feel like you go to the regular gym, you don't see anybody rotating. There's always forward, and back, sagittal plane.
You
and
rarely even see lateral movement
you
at
don't-
gyms.
Yeah, you don't see any of that. And you definitely don't see rotation. So again, that's another important one.
Okay, I know I said the last one was my favorite, but this one's really actually my favorite. It's the hip flexion. So
Okay.
things like hanging knee raises, toes to bar, anything hanging, or like knees to chest on the floor on sliders. They're super difficult, obviously, but for me, it's one of the most effective ways. And like if you want a sore core, like
And a lot of bang for your buck.
Yeah.
And this is what we talked about earlier, that the hip sometimes is involved in the core, because when you do a hanging leg raise, you would think like, okay, yeah, my abs are on fire, but it's not only your abs, your hip flexors that connect to your core, but they also connect to your leg, are important there too. They're working, two muscles are working, well, it's not two muscles, a lot more than that, but these two big muscle groups are working together.
Conjunction. So if you don't think that your hips are working, try holding an L sit with your legs straight for a little bit of time, and it's gonna start burning.
And
right
it's
here.
not your abs that are gonna be hurting,
No.
it's your hip flexors.
Yeah.
Since you said your favorite, one of my favorites is what I would put under the bucket of dynamic stability. This means your core is doing a whole lot while you're doing something else. Like for example, farmer's carries or bear crawls. Like you don't think of those bear crawls as a core exercise because your arms are already burning, your quads are burning, but you better believe that your core is on fire, working like crazy to keep you stable, to allow for the other limbs to move. So bear crawls, all sorts of variations of farmer's carries, whether it's overhead, one arm, bottoms up kettlebell, sandbag. There's so many variations where I call it dynamic because you're moving and your core is just doing its thing without you really even thinking about it.
Yeah, and you probably don't notice it because your forearms are killing on the farmer's carries. Other things are hurting. You're like, how is this working my abs? But that, like you said, that's such a good one. It's so overlooked. And it's one of the hardest ones to sell to the average person. Like, I'm just walking with weights. What is that really doing for me?
Yep.
But we know the internal mechanisms that are going off there.
And again, once I said in the beginning, but once you understand the function of the core, then you can be like, and you'll think about it. You'll be doing like a side plank leg raise and you'll be like, I know there's a lot of muscles burning here, but man, my core is firing like crazy.
Yep.
You start to think about, those functions. So
myth number 2 is that core training leads to six-pack shredded abs.
I feel like, do we really have to talk about this again? We've done like 4 podcasts on it. I hope you guys know by now that spot reduction is a myth, that if you train your abs doesn't mean that you're gonna lose belly fat.
I'm not listening to you, dude. I'm going to go out and do 6 days of abs.
No, I mean, knock yourself out. But there's 2 things I want to say here. Number 1 is the obvious, that the way that you lose belly fat has nothing really to do. Having visible abs, in other words, is more about nutrition and being in a calorie deficit. And I would also say that you don't need to see your abs to have strong abs. Like one of my pet peeves when people say abs, I don't have any of those. It's like, you can't see them, but believe you me,
What are
you
you,
have
a
abs in
gelatinous
there.
blob?
Yeah.
You're a gelatinous blob? Like,
In other words, you can have super strong abs and have good muscle endurance and strength and not visibly see your abs.
I always tell people, you have abs, they're just shy. And they're usually hiding behind a little curtain of fat because they're,
Yeah, there you go.
like
I don't
Usher.
have a 6-pack, I have a whole keg.
Guys, we've heard them all.
We've heard them all.
We don't
Please,
want to hear
just-
them anymore. Myth number 3 is you only train your core on a specific ab day, obviously, because, you have arm day, you have leg day, you're going to have ab day, right?
So that's, like you said earlier, when our clients, which happens a lot, is like, I really want to do more core. And I have to tell them, you've been doing core this
You
entire
back
hour
squatted,
without
you
knowing.
did so much. Like,
So, and that's when, the way that we train here, I'm not saying that all strength training is like core training, but the way
yes.
that we train, which you can go under the category of functional training, even though that term's been, kind of misused as of late. But what I mean by functional training is you're not just sitting in a machine training your chest. When you work out at BFit, for example, you're doing, single arm walking lunges, overhead walking lunges. You're doing a Bulgarian, holding weight on one side. Your core is working like crazy when you do those exercises. So to debunk this myth, I would say that you're training your core all the time if you're doing a proper program with compound lifts, and especially if you're doing more like functional things where you're not sitting in machines. You're doing things with kettlebells, barbells, bands, your body weight. So you are training your core. Now, can you throw in some hanging knee raises? Can you throw in some direct ab work? Yeah, but you don't have to do that on an ab day.
Yeah.
You can do that all the time.
Yeah. And that's something that I always tell people when they want to go work out by themselves and they want to use the Smith machine for squats and things like that. I'm like, if you want to just target your legs, sure, go for it. But you're doing yourself a disservice when you could be doing a regular back squat on a bar and working your whole core, as we've been talking about, while also working the legs. But
unless you want to just target
that's
the
what I'm
legs.
saying. That's what I said. Like, if you want to
that's
just
a
target
different
legs,
story.
yeah.
You know, like there is a time and a place for sitting on a machine and
For
just
sure.
working on the muscle.
Especially like bodybuilders, things like that. Yeah, you have to.
I think for most people, that doesn't apply.
So as always, we like to give you guys some practical advice, and you might be wondering, how are we going to give practical advice if we're just talking about the core? But we want to give you guys some knowledge so you know the benefits and some of the most effective ways to train it.
Oh yeah.
A lot of sit-ups. Bounce break.
Okay, so quickly brushing through the benefits. We already talked about a lot of them, but just to state them clearly. Number one, posture. We talked about it already. It helps with keeping you upright and just having better posture and a stronger and having more endurance in that area. It helps with balance and stability. And that's not just, when people think about balance and stability, they're thinking about certain exercises. They're like, oh, my balance sucks when I stand on one leg. We're talking about in everyday life, you need balance and stability. You know,
just walking,
going up the stairs, you're picking things up. Like you're doing things all the time that you need these skills for or these traits. So training your core is gonna, I mean, I always joke about it, and I know it sounds cocky, but like I always say I don't fall, because when I trip on something, I feel like I have enough training to like catch myself, so like I rarely fall. And it's a half joke, because it is true that the more, and this is something we do like with the elderly population to prevent falls, the stronger your core is and the more you're training power, the more you can catch yourself, or if you do fall, you're more resilient.
Yeah.
So again, I want you guys thinking about like everyday life and not just like, I'm getting better at exercise.
I'm glad you mentioned the slipping and falling and training the elderly, because injury prevention is one of the most important benefits of having a strong core, especially for lower back, for your hip. All of these things can be not prevented because life is crazy and things happen, but having a strong core definitely helps.
Reduces the
risk.
chances.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. And then another thing that's related to like injury prevention and lower back health is breathing, proper breathing. So again, that diaphragm plays a big role, and that's something that you can practice. I do it with my clients all the time. It's just like deep belly breathing. You'd be surprised how people don't know how to breathe into their belly like that, like because we're used to kind of taking shorter breaths and breathing into your chest. So that's another way that A, helps you relax, and B, can help with injury prevention. Like PTs will tell you all the time, like, you know, they'll make you breathe, and the average person's like, why am I doing this stupid breathing exercise? Like my foot hurts. And it's like, trust me, this stuff helps, you know?
I think a good way to learn how to do that too is by laying down, putting a weight on your stomach and trying to like inflate it up and down.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people, like you said, they just don't know how to do it.
Yep.
So there's like, we can give you some advice, we can give you some tips if you come in, we'll help you kind of figure that out.
Yeah, for sure. And then the last benefit is athletic performance. Of course, this is something that may not apply to everyone listening, but I don't know, maybe they are weekend warriors or they play pickleball on the weekends. Yeah. But it 100%, the core is so important. That's why you see professional athletes doing not just your basic exercises, which are important, but you see them doing some other funky things that require so much more coordination, stability. That transfer that I was talking about is because they're doing things that are way, like if you watch sports, it's like they're getting into positions where
some acrobatic, like weird landing weird and trying to keep your feet in bounds and all that is.
To me, one of the most amazing things, I think one of the most amazing positions is
cornerback.
The cornerbacks and the wide receivers in football, because they are doing so many high-level things at once without even really thinking about it. They are running as fast as they can, cutting, still running as fast as they can. Somebody throws an object at them. They got a guy chasing them, and they got to jump up, try to grab that thing, but then they have to stay in bounds. So they have to twist, land, make sure both feet stay in, and then they get tackled. It's one of the most amazing things if you're into like biomechanics.
It just happened yesterday.
And you can't do that if you don't have a solid core.
It just happened yesterday. They threw a pass to George Pickens, and he caught it at the out of bounds right here. He got one foot in, but the other one was up like that, and they pushed him out, but he still caught it.
Unbelievable.
It's a crazy thing to watch. So to wrap it up, how should these people be thinking about training their core besides obviously doing a bunch of sit-ups?
Yeah, so I think that balance is key. We talked about a lot of things, and I'm sure people are a little bit confused with all the, anti-rotation, anti-extension. It's like, God, that sounds like a lot. I gotta add all that stuff to my crunch training.
You're probably doing it already.
You're doing a lot of it already, but I would say when I say balance, I mean make sure that you're not neglecting anything, right? In other words, most people who lift weights, from my experience, they have a strong lower back already because they're doing deadlifts and squats and all that kind of stuff that your lower back is already solid. However, they don't have a strong anterior core, the front of your core. So there's an imbalance between the front and the back of your body, right? So that means that you need to do a little bit more front to balance it out. But just like you're doing front and back, you're also doing side to side. Am I doing some rotation? Am I doing some farmer's carries to work on that dynamic? So what I mean is having balance in your training that to make sure that you're hitting at least a little bit of these. You don't have to be so psychotic about it.
And if you're doing compound lifts or training like we do here at BFit, we're covering the essential lifts, then you should be fine. You already kind of have all your bases covered.
Pretty much. And that's why I'm sure it's like clicking in your heads as you're listening to this. If you're a BFit member, we're like, oh, that's why we do all these funky movements. And instead of just, to target our abs doing flutter kicks or crunches, we're doing all these different side plank variations, and we're doing payloft variations and walking with
a farmer's carry with one weight heavy on one side, yeah,
offset. And now you understand why we do that is because we are in the background strategically taking all these things, checking all these boxes. But what happens is most people don't follow a like solid program. They're just doing whatever they see on Instagram or whatever they know, which is usually some sort of like crunch and like the cliche ab exercises. And this is better advice even for them. So send this to someone you know who trains wrong.
Or somebody that's going to, unfortunately, a lot of places just stick to these basic lifts and they neglect the farmer's carries, the overhead stuff. So, you might want to analyze what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. But I will say a lot of places now are doing smarter stuff, and they're doing like a lot of these functional equipment. Like I see a lot more kettlebell training, more sandbag training, more resistance bands. And if you're doing that kind of training,
stuff,
you're inherently doing core training by using those type of modalities.
Which means you don't have to do those stupid bicycles anymore.
Thank God.
Yeah,
we haven't done that since 1999.
Yeah, we really don't like them.
Yeah, I mean, well, if it's not giving you more bang for your buck, why the hell do it?
Yeah,
that's the beauty of
you're going through the unnecessary pain. Like,
just to give a few more examples of things that we incorporate here. For example, instead of doing a back squat, even though the back squat is lighting up your core, grab a sandbag, put it over one shoulder. Now you're doing asymmetrical loading. Your core has to do. It's a different type of challenge for your core. It has to engage like crazy to prevent you from doing all kinds of unwanted movements. So that's something that we would do here. Another example would be like a single arm walking overhead lunge. And that's a mouthful, but why do we do that? It's not just because it looks cool. It's because you're working on the stability of the shoulder with the one arm. You're offsetting the weight again. Your core has to do a lot. Whenever you put your arms overhead and carry weight, your core is working. So again, we throw these things in there strategically.
Yeah, it's not just to mess with you guys. I don't think we're evil geniuses and we're just messing with you, but these things all have a purpose.
And this is why we always talk about good training versus like mediocre training. A lot of trainers and people do things just because it looks cool, or let's switch it up today and let's just add a kettlebell here and a kettlebell there. I would encourage, even if you don't train with us, ask whoever is prescribing the exercise, what is this for?
Yeah.
Why are we doing it with one leg? Why is this exercise? If they can't really give you an answer, then you know that it wasn't strategically programmed.
They might have just seen it on Instagram.
Yeah, and these things are important because, for example, what I see a lot of mistakes is like too much of certain muscle groups. So say you're doing like the gym that you're going to is doing an ab finisher, but it's 5 exercises that work only the rectus abdomini. Like it's the same exact muscle group 4 times, as opposed to rectus abdomini, oblique, a little bit of erectors. Like switch it up so that you're not just overkill. That takes a little bit of strategic programming.
Yeah, which we do here. So
just come here.
Yeah, I mean, really, the whole thing is a pitch for you to come here.
Let's be honest. One more point to add to that is whatever you are doing, be mindful of bracing your core. And we say this all the time: brace your core, engage your core. Like you said, a lot of people don't really know how to do that, so it might take a little bit of practice. But whatever you're doing, if it involves moving your body, you're working your core, right? Whether you know it or not. Even walking around, you could be mindful about my posture, right? That's still core. Walking up a flight of stairs. But definitely if you're exercising, you should be very mindful of what is happening in here, because I can tell you this takes a while to learn, but a goblet squat could be completely different when you know how to brace your core than when you don't.
Yep.
So I would my biggest piece of advice would be mindful of how to brace your core and what your core is doing. For example, I see it butchered all the time, like single leg RDLs, people butcher them. Why? Because it requires a lot of single leg balance. Your arms are usually doing something, and then your core is what's really holding it all together, but your core usually tends to collapse. You start rounding your back, you start rotating
in one
exactly.
direction,
So think about it. Of course, if you have a trainer, it helps a lot more to give you those cues like, hey, this happens all the time. You're rotating. I don't know if you're noticing, but you're rotating it a little bit, or you're rounding a little bit.
Let's fix it,
Yeah, you need feedback sometimes.
For sure, we all do. All right, so we're gonna leave you guys with 3 quick little tips. The first one is gonna be, don't have a designated core or ab day. Just sprinkle it in with the rest of your workout. If you're doing already a leg day, you can throw in a superset. Maybe you do a leg machine or something. Throw in some payloft presses, something along those lines.
Yeah, and that's not to say that there isn't anything inherently wrong with doing a core day. You can absolutely do a core day, but I think for most people that are listening that are busy, let's say you have 4 days to work out, one of them should not be core.
No.
Right? It's much easier to sprinkle these exercises, 2 or 3 exercises. And again, if you're doing more functional type of strength training, you're already hitting your core. You just need to sprinkle. It's literally just sprinkling here and there. A hanging knee raise there, a payloft hold or rotation there, and you'll cover your bases for sure. Second thing goes hand in hand, which is pick exercises that give you more bang for your buck. And some of our favorites would be farmer's carry variations, anything like you said, hanging knee or hanging leg raises, whether that's from a bar or from a dip bar. I'm a big fan of doing like pikes, anything from a prone position, whether it's pikes or knees to chest, rollouts, anything that's either plank or body saws or
Copenhagen
rollouts, things like that. Yup. Those things are going to give you a lot more bang for your buck. A lot more core muscles are firing there as opposed to, I hate picking on crunches. I can't think of any other examples, but like crunches is what most people do.
And I still like crunches over sit-ups.
Crunches, sit-ups, and like
poor Russian twists.
Yeah, Russian twists. Like that's not gonna give you a lot of bang for your buck.
Yeah.
Like I kid you not. I don't remember the last time I did a crunch. I don't crunch. Why? Because I do better exercises. So that's the tip. I know what you're gonna say. I'm not gonna do it.
I wasn't gonna say anything.
See your stomach.
What was that say? All right, let's see it. And the third and last one is gonna be to do it as a finisher, maybe at the end of the workout, or sprinkle it, like I said earlier, into a superset. I think that's a far more efficient way to do it.
Yep, agreed. So to conclude, I think it's obvious by now that it's very important to be training your core, but it's even more important to train it properly. So I hope that this helps. I hope that you learned a little bit about the function of the core, what its true function is, as well as some ideas and exercises to target it in a better way.
Yep. And with that being said, let's do our outro, flexing our core the whole time.
If you're a real badass, you can learn to talk normally while
I'm flexing
right now. Deep.
I'm flexing so fucking hard. See that right there? I think I'm gonna shit my pants. With that being said, guys, thanks for tuning in to the Beef and Bros podcast. We'll see you next week.
Do your Kegels in the car while you're listening to this.
Do your Kegels, but only do the ones that go in, because there's Kegels that you can push out. And I suggest doing those on the toilet because you will.
I heard that doing Kegels is a way to.
You will piss yourself.